any homicide investigator worth their salt, if they fail, if they either don't bring somebody to justice and, basically satisfy the victim's family so they can grieve and move on and know that the police know they've protected society, or they get it wrong, they will carry that to their grave. I've been retired from the police well over a decade, going towards 2 decades now, and I still think about the cases that I was working on and or hadn't solved today. I still have relationships with some, not all, victims' families. It's that personal.
Hi everyone, I'm sorry it's been a while. I'd like to apologise for the delay in uploads recently. We've had some family health issues which has made recording a bit of a challenge, but good news, things have settled down for the time being, so hopefully we'll be back to our normal schedule pretty soon. So for today's episode, we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into something we've touched on before. If you recall, I think it was earlier this year, we did an episode on homicide, and we tried to dispel some of the myths between how homicide investigation is portrayed in the media, TV and movies, and how it actually works in real life. We barely scratched the surface, to be honest. It's one of those subjects that could go on and on and on. But we wanted to try and, rather than just have one very long episode trying to explain the whole thing front to back, we thought we'd just kind of take pieces of it and look at different elements in a bit more detail. And then that might invite a little bit of feedback, because we have had feedback from some listeners saying, can you explore this a bit more? Can you talk more about this? So the topic for today is cold cases. And cold cases as a term first emerged around the 1970s in UK law enforcement and academia. It took about 10, 20 years for it to kind of leak into the media space when it was picked up in shows like Hill Street Blues and Law and Order and things of that kind. And then we started seeing dedicated TV shows to cold cases and cold case investigations. But now we're going to try and do that again. We're going to go back to what perhaps the media gets wrong and what it's like actually in real life. So I don't think any trigger warning is required, because I don't think we're going to anything too griefy today, but we will be talking about homicide and murders and bodies and things, but we'll try and keep it fairly tame. So Howard, maybe you want to kick us off by saying, in truth, what actually is a cold case?
The first thing to think about with a homicide is it happens at a point in time, and time really matters in all of these investigations. So if Mark stabbed me in the chest right now and I died, that's a point in time. But time was in existence before that, and time runs after I'm stabbed and died. I would call this the investigative continuum. So leading up to the actual event of the homicide, the killing, there's often loads of what you might call precursor events, things that people have done to prepare to carry out a homicide. Mark might decide he hates me, so he's going to kill me. Then he thinks, well, how am I going to do it? Well, I need to go out and buy a knife that's good enough. I need to research on Google how I can do it and get away with it. And I need to find a time when I'm physically right next to him so I can stick the knife in him. So there's lots of precursor events along that timeline. Then the homicide occurs. Mark runs away and tries to conceal his tracks in the time that's afterwards. I'm laid on the floor till somebody comes in and discovers me. Eventually the police are called and they would start an investigation. So the time is still running. The truth is, in a homicide or a major investigation, time never stops. Conceptually, you have to understand there's no such thing as the end of a case. Because if you were a victim or a member of a victim's family, a loved one, the fact that your loved one was killed, that never goes away for you in your lifetime. You might learn to cope with the grief, but it don't go away. So it's creating memories. Also, in the investigation, sometimes you get to a point in an investigation where you catch somebody and you take them to court and they're prosecuted and found guilty. And you might think the investigation should stop there. Often it does. But in reality, you have to accept that sometimes we convict the wrong people. So the investigation actually hasn't finished because we haven't resolved the truth about who and how and when and where and why a homicide occurred. So just because somebody got convicted, for me, that's not the end of a homicide inquiry. So here's this timeline. If you can imagine it, there's the time leading up to the homicide itself, which triggers an investigation, and the time afterwards. So what do law enforcement do when a homicide occurs? Now, we've talked about this with homicide, they kick an investigation off, and they will research going back for precursor events to look at any information that might help learn about the homicide. They also do things at the time, collection of forensic evidence, witness evidence, telephone and computer databases, whatever source of information they can find to create lines of inquiry. The objective of law enforcement, is to collect enough facts so that when they find a suspect, which is the first task, the second task is, can we get them before a court of law for them to be convicted of the offence? Is there enough evidence? Because most legal systems require a certain amount of evidence. It's not a kangaroo court system. Now, all the time that the investigators are doing that, something called the review process kicks in. This is where other people are looking over the shoulder of the actual investigators and kind of QAing the process.
This is in UK law enforcement.
Globally, European, Western, North American. I can't confirm it's in every case, but it's certainly not just the UK. The way that they do these reviews, that does change globally according to local practice and local law and resourcing. But the gold standard, if you will, is that alongside an investigation, you have this QA process. And it can even start with what they call a hot review or a hot debrief within 24 hours of the body being discovered. So the idea that, we'll look at it after a year or 6 months or 20 years. No. This is actually a live thing. The object at that stage is to find out, are the investigators doing everything they can, or is there potentially something they may have missed, or could be done more efficiently?
And am I right in saying that in different police departments, especially in the US, you're describing a function? So you're describing the first tier is the investigative function, the second tier is the review function. I think from your background, we'll get to this in a bit, but you had like a team for that. But in other smaller departments, that function might be carried out by might be that one officer or more senior officer they might do, but all those functions might be done by a very small team of investigators.
Absolutely. And the processes and the principles are the same. But I've known certain police forces, little local forces in certain Western countries, where a homicide would be investigated by one detective and closed after 3 or 4 days. There's no further lines of inquiry. Now, I beg to differ. It's the classic case of the more resources you put into it, the more chances you have of getting to the truth of the matter, because the data decays, the forensic evidence, witness evidence, it disappears into the ether, if you will. So it's harder to find the longer you leave it. The same happens with review. Some places, the review, certainly in the UK, the review process can be as exhaustive and resource intensive almost as the actual investigation. But I also know places where the review is somebody who's also doing live investigations, has never been trained in reviews, and may even never have been trained to a good standard in specialist investigations like homicide to actually do it. So you get investigation with a small I and review with a small r in layman's terms.
But that's different to a cold case, right? A cold case is something different.
Hang on. Yes, but I'm getting there. So the murder's happened. You've got a live investigation team doing their best, no matter how many resources they've got and how long, but they're doing the live investigation. And the review process has started. Now, a live investigation can have problems. Firstly, they can catch somebody and put them before a court of law. And logic dictates that, certainly from the investigator's point of view, they will usually stop that investigation then. The reason being, there isn't just one homicide in that department or the world to investigate. New homicides are occurring all the time. These are expensive resources in law enforcement terms, and you can't just leave them carrying on infinitum. There's a point where, for economy and for best use of resources, they have to say, I can't see any feasible way of moving that forward. So I'm going to now concentrate on other inquiries that need more of my attention. It's kind of a conveyor belt.
So it's like a tipping point where the investigator or team is persuaded that we've done enough, and yes, we could hypothesize that other people may be responsible, but we feel at that point in time there's enough to stop.
Yeah, maybe the lines of inquiry, we've exhausted them from the information we've got right now, or the likelihood of them leading anywhere isn't enough to justify it, and we've got all these other murders that have happened since that are more important. When you have a process that uses resources, you have to at some point call it a day and put those resources to better use elsewhere. That's just the reality of life. Now, and I say the other example is we catch somebody, they're convicted and off they go to jail, or, the problem is solved and the live investigation team moves on. In the UK, most live investigation teams are carrying a high workload of multiple investigations at the same time. So the kind of thing you see on TV where they're looking at one homicide is virtually non-existent. It might be convenient for a storyline, but it ain't the truth. The first question, the homicide you're working on a media event is, well, which one? You don't say that because it's embarrassing.
I want to support that. I just want to flag as well, because I feel that kind of mirrors I should say for the listeners, strangely, you and I have worked a lot together. In Intel, we've never worked together on a murder, and our careers went in separate ways. But what I observed at the start of my career was when it was the homicide and major inquiry team, the resourcing and the funding wasn't an issue. It was like peak policing, right? The budgets were the biggest. It felt like an army for a murder. But then I felt over the next 10 years when the austerity measures hit, it felt like the resources you were asking more and more of less and less people, and the teams seemed to shrink and shrink and shrink. Is that fair?
It did, and it did with national policy as well. Now, part of the reason for that, you could say, was the advancement in forensic science that would do some of the things that the police officers never could. But the other reason, you're right to say, is the volume of not only the number of homicides, but mainly the amount of data that an investigation could turn up. If you were looking at 10 homicides, you'd actually, in 1980, and then you moved to 10 homicides in 2000, the amount of data for each homicide would have gone up not by 2 times or 3 times. It would be a factor, like 10, 50, 100 times the amount of data. And working through that data by hand takes time. So that was the issue. And you'll find in national policy over time, certainly in the UK, we started categorizing murders into different levels in terms of the severity of the murder, the impact, how violent it was, and they got different levels of resources. That's just the truth. It's like the health service or any other public service. It's paid for out of the public purse, out of the population, and the budget is what it is. And sometimes you have to make choices about what you can fund, not only about whether you have the resource or not, but how long the resource spends on a task. That's just business, the reality of life. Anyway, so that's that. The review process is running from the moment a murder happens. Now, what's interesting, I think personally, and I did my PhD on cold case homicides, having been a cold case and live homicide investigator, I wanted to put some academic learning into it. Because most of the time investigators are too busy investigating to stop and think about, they don't have the time or the freedom to do what they could do. They're all capable of it. Think about the long game and, well, how could we improve process? And that's no disrespect to them. I was in that situation, but I found time. The review process is running after the murder. But if you think about the point where the investigative team say, not that we've caught somebody and they've gone to court, we can't go any further. From that point, it's what you would call a cold case. And I hate the term, but I'll use it because it's publicly the most well known. It implies it's gone cold. And
can I clarify? But that's sorry. Just I may have misunderstood. So you're saying even if a suspect is put before a prosecution, so because I think in the US they define a cold case as where the open lines of inquiry is ceased. Are you saying it's different from that? So you're saying a person. Sorry, go on. You clarify for me.
No, that's exactly the point. If they've run out of what you might call useful and productive lines of inquiry, there's a formal review that says we can't go any further, and if everybody else agrees from a budget and resourcing point of view, at that point, the file is closed with a small c, and basically the live investigation team move on to other things, and that's when it's a cold case. But what happens, certainly in the UK and across Europe, and to a certain extent in North America now, it's growing all the time. Good practice is the review team keep reviewing the case. They keep going back every so often and having a look. Why? Because a new forensic method might turn up that allows you to take a look at the same old data but through a different lens, or some new information may come into the system.
So for our non-police listeners, what you're calling the review team, and I appreciate that's a specified term, that's what they would see to be the cold case team that would be presented on TV. The review team is the cold case team, right? Okay.
Yes. But most review teams review not just cold cases, but live cases that are still being investigated. Yeah. So once the point is, the review team's there all the time, The live investigation team aren't. They've parked it and moved on to more important or more productive inquiries. The review process and the people behind it don't. So what happens is, even though that case is closed, the review team periodically will look at those cases. But it's under pressure for resources. In my case, as well as reviewing live cases in my home force and for other forces, because we had a lot of expertise that other forces didn't have the resources for, so they'd call us in and say, would you mind looking at this one? And of course, the answer is always yes, you help each other out. There was a requirement, because the review process had improved over the years and the science had improved, particularly around DNA. What happened was a lot of forces, my own included, said, go back and take a fresh look at old investigations. Of all the hundreds of unsolved murders in our particular jurisdictional area, go through them all, but cherry pick a few that might be worth reinvestigating. And if you find some that are useful, start reinvestigating them. And up to a certain point, you take that investigation and you either conclude it, or they would take it from you if it needed more resources and give it to a live team again. It's all about efficiency of resource. I used to do that. I was doing reviews all the time, but my other responsibility was to look at all cold cases in the force, my force.
And I know you hate it when I quote this, but I think it's worth raising. You had an unusually high detection rate, didn't you, in that regard?
Yeah, 100%. I tried to do better, but it's a bit of a false figure because, like I say, we went through all the cases in my force and we weren't actually just doing murders. I was given, at the time, my little period of doing this, my home force had 53, what you might call cold case murders that had been parked as not feasible to have live investigation teams. But it also had the thick end of 3,000 serious sexual offences, rape. So some of the murders were given back to live teams for various reasons. But out of those 53, me and my team were given the responsibility for 42 of these cold cases, murders, and we were given all the rapes. So off we go and we start looking at them. Now again, we're just a small team. The data from those murders, you had to say, well, you can't reinvestigate every one. You have to prioritise them. So what can we find that would justify picking case A over case B? And the answer was usually, is the new forensic evidence, or is the forensic evidence that the new methodology that we have these days, the case might be 20 years old. Forensic science has moved on phenomenally in 20 years. Can we apply new science to the old forensic material if it's still there?
And that's DNA, right? Because DNA is the big shift, isn't it?
Principally, yes. There were a few other things. I mean, in my area, we had CAD drawings. Forensically, you could take a photo of a knife wound in flesh and bone, and you could recreate using a computer the length, the shape, the blade of the knife.
Angle of penetration and stuff.
Angle of penetration is an easy one. But you could actually come away and say, this was such and such, it was a bread knife from a kitchen set, or it was an ice pick just from the wound. You couldn't do that back when the investigators first did it any more than you could do DNA. So forensic science takes in engineering, if you like, physical options as well as biological options. The other thing I need to pick up on is decay. The older the cases, the longer that the forensic evidence that's left has had chance to decay, and that the witnesses have had to decay, if that makes sense, and suspects. I had 2 murders, cold cases, that I believe were linked, that we weren't able to take further because in the meantime, the guy who came out as the chief suspect had died. So what's the point of investigating it to court when you can't prosecute somebody? We did work on the investigation to try and help the families, the victims' families, but we weren't going to get a conviction.
But can I just at this point to point out to people that you're not just talking about biological decay in terms of things deteriorating or people getting old or physical material, but also that decay can apply to paper records, data records, all sorts of forces.
Absolutely.
Why things start vanishing from the record.
Yep. One of the tasks I had, and I had a team of volunteers who would take paper records, even things like media reports from back in the day when television wasn't the way forward, it was media in the form of printed media, newspapers and things. And they would digitize it. They would scan a physical piece of paper and then use a character reader to create the text and create text that could then be uploaded into a computer as text, not as an image, if that makes sense. The problem with this material, firstly, there's the physical delay. Does it still exist? If it's biological, has it deteriorated? Even some of the newspapers, the paper they were printed on, it had deteriorated, or the ink had run, or it had got damp. So on the day it was seized, you could have read the article perfectly, but 30, 40 years later, if you can read one word in 10, you're lucky. Human memory decays as well. And to go to a potential witness 30 or 40 years later and say, can you remember what you were doing on the 24th of July, 1982? Or they'd got old, and if they hadn't died, their memory had gone. That's just a fact. The reason I mention that, it means resource doesn't stay static. It reduces. So your ability to go back and look at stuff, the pot of what you can look at, the pot of gold in terms of raw material, is shrinking all the time. The second problem is, to take a case to court, you have to have evidence to a certain value. And one of the things with physical evidence is you have to be able to produce what they call a chain of continuity. If, Mark, you'd stabbed me today and there was a knife left on the desk, you dropped it and run out, and the police seized that, that starts the chain of continuity. And Officer A seizes it, passes it to Officer B, and it has to be recorded. There's a record of every transfer all the way to when it gets to a forensic science laboratory and is put into storage. And every time it's taken out of storage or put back in, it should be recorded. The moment that chain breaks, it's a legitimate question to ask. How do we know the knife that you're looking at is actually the knife that was used at the time, 20, 30, 40 years later? Major problem. So even if we had decayed material there, and often it was lost, if you couldn't prove a chain of continuity, you might be able to investigate it scientifically, physically, but that's not going to be permissible evidence, certainly in a UK and a North American court of law, and in many courts of law that follow that kind of investigation. And rightly so. So do you see how that becomes a problem? You can't forensically examine usefully material that has either decayed or been lost or is no longer part of a chain of evidence. So again, that pot of gold, suddenly you've lost a lot.
And that kind of, we didn't get a chance to touch on this in the homicide episode, but there's this notion in Hollywood and media that I think comes from US terminology, this idea of means, motive and opportunity. But I'm right in saying that's not necessarily a framework that you see in UK homicide investigation. You don't seem to think about it in those terms, right?
The policies for investigating homicide do, and we call it MOPS, method, objective, preparation and subsequent conduct. Sorry, motive, operation, preparation and subsequent conduct. In other words, why do I want to kill somebody? How am I going to kill them? What do I need to do to prepare? And after I've killed them, what do I do afterwards? I go somewhere and bathe myself in petrol to try and mask biological forensic examination, or I dispose of a weapon, or I'll try and wipe my phone. You see the gangsters in America throwing guns into rivers and stuff.
That's really interesting, because means, motive and opportunity is all about, okay, everybody can kind of get that, but MOPS is, just take me through the stages one at a time. So the first one is
motive.
Motive, so you establish a motive. The second one is opportunity, okay, and the second...
Even though I want to kill somebody, if I can't have an opportunity to get next to him or do it in the way I want to...
Yeah. And the third one?
Preparation.
Okay, and finally?
Subsequent conduct.
So I think that's a really after the event, and that gives because I think that gives an actually it's a good evidence base to form a prosecution, right? Because obviously you're not, and I suppose that last bit is crucial because we don't tend to think about the activity of the murderer after but actually that's vital evidence, right?
It's crucial because there's, as we touched on in the live homicide podcast that we did before, a murder can arise from an incident in UK law if the person dies within a year and a day. So you could stab me today, and if I don't die for a year, you've a year to go about doing whatever the heck you want to do. So that subsequent conduct could span an awful long time, and it still be murder. And there's a similar, it's not the same time period, but there's a similar principle in most Western law enforcement and most law enforcement globally. So Yeah, subsequent conduct matters. The other thing is, with subsequent conduct, it can actually prove innocence. Let me give you a couple of examples. I'll give you, the first one I want to talk about is this idea of evidence decay. I was involved in the review of a homicide where, from a long time ago, decades ago, where an elderly gentleman in his house who required oxygen was beaten to death with his own oxygen cylinder. And that was investigated professionally at the time. And although a suspect, or the person that we thought, when we reinvestigated it or we reviewed it as a cold case, we thought was a good, somebody that should be investigated more. He died though. That's why this is the one where he died, so we couldn't take it any further. After the murder, the subsequent conduct, the gas bottle was laid next to the victim, covered in blood, quite a gory murder. But there were blood spatterings upstairs. And the question arose, well, if this gentleman is disabled and can't go upstairs, basically lived in a chair, who went upstairs? Now, it could have been a medic or a police officer that just happened to get blood on their hands when they first arrived at the scene. But it could also have been the murderer or murderers plural, or somebody else, somebody who was helping out, or just a visitor, Because that was so many years ago, the property the gentleman lived in was, in the UK, what we call a council house. It was a publicly owned home that people rent rather than buying their own home. It's a kind of social housing. And after the gentleman had died, clearly the social housing, it's kept as a scene for a while by the police, but when they've done all they think they can as useful inquiries, it's handed back to the local authority who would refurbish it and then rent it to other people. That house still existed when I had it as a cold case. We arranged for the house to be revisited. Over the decades, it had had multiple occupants and multiple redecorations. And in the UK, one of the things we do is we use paint, gloss paint. And the skirting boards and other part, and the doors have got people don't take the old paint off, they tend to sand it down and paint over, or just paint over without sanding. We wanted to explore, one of the lines of inquiry to explore was this reporting of blood spattering up the stairs and in a couple of places in the bathroom. To get to that blood, forensically, we had to have there were 14 layers in some places of paint. But by carefully going through those layers, not me, the forensic scientists, were able to get to the original layer of paint and recover blood. That blood gave us forensic material from a third party that turned out to be the suspect. So that, from it being a police officer or anybody else, suddenly we've got a very strong link by going back to a scene.
So not the victim's blood, the blood of the suspect, and that blood had been there for decades and
painted over and painted over and painted.
You'd arranged for what section of the wall to be removed and forensically tested, or?
Didn't need to remove it, it was done in the property.
Wow. Oh, so it's layer upon layer of paint, but the actual blood was deep down in the layer. Okay.
Yeah, the thickest point was, I think it was on the skirting board, I can't remember now, God, it's 2 decades ago. But I think the thickest point, there were 14 layers, because you don't always paint everywhere in the house at once. Anyway, so what I'm getting at is, as a cold case investigation, you have to think about, just because this is what's left, what might there be out there that's still there?
And that's really we're thinking. A skirting board is essentially almost a record, and it's a record of decorations. Going back to your first description of, I think you called it the continuum, right? It's like you've got to think that continuum. How far back can you go? That's crazy.
Well, again, it comes back to this idea of subsequent conduct. I don't know this because we weren't able to interview the potential suspect because he was dead, but you could speculate that having committed a very bloody murder with using this thing, I'd be surprised if the murderer had gone into the house wearing rubber gloves or a rubber suit to protect himself, because then the occupant might have thought, why is he in a rubber suit or rubber gloves? So potentially was barehanded. And you have to think about these things to create potential lines of inquiry. You're just theorizing. Try and consider the options, what might have happened. And after it's happened, if the cylinder's covered in blood, potentially the suspect's hands are, you're not going to go walking down the street when you leave the property with blood-covered hands. So maybe the suspect went upstairs, because the bathroom was upstairs, and washed their hands in the sink. There was blood under the sink and up and down up the stairs. I can never prove that, but that was my team's working theory at the time. Another one, and this was a wrongful conviction case. It's actually a very well-known one that's been publicly mentioned before, where a gentleman was convicted and it was found that he was wrongfully convicted after nearly a couple of decades. This was one where a little girl, 11-year-old girl, was abducted. So initially she was reported as missing from home, and then her body was found some miles away. And she was wearing tights, and she was subject to the science, best forensic science at the time. It was an awful murder, it received a lot of resourcing, a lot of public attention, and we had a conviction and a person sent to prison. But when it was found out that this person in prison forensically couldn't have committed the murder because he didn't have the ability to create the forensic material that was found on the body. So you think, well, we don't know who it is, but it's certainly not him. And I won't bore you with the details. We went back to look again, or the team, not me personally, went back to look again forensically at what had been recovered. And inside the girl's tights, little girl's tights that she was wearing at the time she went missing, and on the body, they found those tights had been sellotaped. The forensic scientists, I don't know what they use now, they used to use sellotape to lift things like hairs or bits of material because it sticks without damaging the underlying material. And those tapings had been preserved. On one of those tapings was a 4mm piece of human hair, that small. In the intervening years, science had advanced so that you could look at the root of a hair and extract DNA. At the time, it was way too small a sample, so it couldn't be done. It wasn't that they missed it. It wasn't a scientific option. These days it was. So the reinvestigation team were able to identify from that a suspect or DNA. Again, think about the murder. This girl had been assaulted and sexually assaulted. Her tights had been removed. How did this piece of hair get in the tights? Now, it could have been at home. It could have been, in a washing basket or something completely innocent, but it could also be a potential suspect. But the moment you get a DNA profile, you can go back to family and friends and eliminate them so we know it's not the washing basket scenario, and by inference, somebody else. And then that profile went on a national database, and sure enough, a few years later, by which time the UK police had introduced a process whereby all suspects who were arrested for certain offences would have their DNA taken and compared against the national database, they got a match. So again, that advance in science and cold case approaches got the right result. But that was one where we'd actually caught somebody, the detectives at the time, and he was wrongfully convicted because they didn't have the scientific evidence to disprove, or to prove that it wasn't him. It couldn't be him, even though he admitted the offences because he was a bit mentally challenged, shall we say.
See, that raises some interesting points for me. So I think the first thing I want to ask about is, so you talk about decay, but in some respects, like, so for instance, what you called the review team, when you first told me about the review team, I was wanting to say, well, that must create a tension between the primary investigators and the review team, who are essentially double-checking the work, right? And I accept everything you're saying about decay of evidence, but it strikes me that policing methodology kind of decades and decades ago was limited by but it wasn't just the technology, there was also kind of social issues, kind of like when we mentioned earlier in this recording, we talked about that kind of tipping point. When do you think, stop, that we have enough, this is our guy? That must create a tension point, maybe perhaps sometimes, because, that must be difficult to manage as a review team, because I guess you might have the investigators think, we've got our guy, I'm happy we've got our guy, but you're saying, we've not got the guy. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The way it's done, the first thing I would say that you'll often see in the media and TV programs where it essentially sensationalizes everything. The investigators miss the obvious clue that the viewer can see because they're either lazy or arrogant or corrupt. That's just a storyline. It's been my experience that the detectives and investigators, because they're not just all police officers, there are civilian staff involved, the forensic scientists and loads of others, technical experts. They are highly trained, highly committed and diligent in their work. These are usually the best of the best, and they are the best resourced of all investigators and departments in an organisation. And rightly so, because it's the most serious offence. So that's the first thing. But even the best of us can get, and we talk about with intelligence and analysis, mental processing and all the rest of it, live investigators are under a great deal of pressure to perform and deliver. And even the best of them can occasionally miss things, where somebody who doesn't have any of that pressure can sit back. There's even a role within the process called critical friend, where another trusted peer, for the senior investigating officer, who was also experienced and a senior investigating officer, will sit down in a one-to-one conversation over a cup of coffee and play devil's advocate and try and poke holes in the theory. Now, the investigators and the managers are trained not to see this as a challenge or undermining their position, but as an opportunity to catch any mistake before it can't be recovered. Personally, if somebody comes, if I'm doing something and I seek developmental feedback, if you want to use the terminology, if somebody can see something that I'm missing, I'm very grateful because it avoids me wasting time and resources and failing for nothing. I'm still the investigator, but somebody's given me an idea. And it's not usually you've missed something. It's have you considered option A, B or C, a scenario, which if you know very well in our circles with intel and analysis, you'd look at alternative hypotheses. And even if they say, no, but we haven't got the resources, it still sits in the back of the mind of the investigator. You're always trying to be open-minded, even though the pressure is to catch somebody and, deliver a product, a practical result. It's a positive process. I know some cases I know of personally, and not just in the UK, where that's not been the case and that trust has broken down. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to have investment in it by everybody that's involved. I have been involved in live investigations and been reviewed, even though I was also a review officer, wearing a different hat at a different time.
And let me ask you, so how did that feel being reviewed?
If the review team approach it in the right way and the organisation understands what it's doing, it's not a blame culture. Although it's uncomfortable, it's less of a discomfort than an investigation failing. Trust me, any homicide investigator worth their salt, if they fail, if they either don't bring somebody to justice and, basically satisfy the victim's family so they can grieve and move on and know that the police know they've protected society, or they get it wrong, they will carry that to their grave. I've been retired from the police well over a decade, going towards 2 decades now, and I still think about the cases that I was working on and or hadn't solved today. I still have relationships with some, not all, victims' families. It's that personal.
I know that one of the big misunderstandings that people get is, because I think you've had this question before, I think you've talked about this when you taught at uni, is that people are minded to ask you, what's an average detection rate? What's a normal detection rate? And I think you said in the past that there's no such thing because there's so many variables between, is it in a city? Is it out in the sticks? Is it from 60 years ago? Is it now? So there's no such thing as an average. I remember watching an interview with a NYPD homicide detective, I think Pete Panuccio, I think it was. I will double check that, so don't take that as gospel. But, and he was saying when he was a homicide detective in the 80s, their mandate was basically, as a homicide detective, you should be getting 60%. Because any lower, you're not doing your job, and any higher, you're probably fixing it a little bit. But I guess that's kind of arbitrary. But I guess. Let me rephrase this. I'm restating your position. Have I got that right? Is it true to say there's no such thing as, you're obviously always aiming for 100%, but there's no way of actually saying what the rate should be? Because in some respects, there are undetectable crimes, right? I guess that there are homicides and serious offences where
you are right. For me, and I speak both as a former investigator, a former reviewer, I've worked on the boards of homicide charities as a trustee. I studied it for my PhD. I've taught at universities and around the world, and I have reflected on it in the abstract, not just as homicide, but as a process, the mental processes, organisational processes. The moment you put a number on it, you've created a falsehood. Think of me, use me as the example here. My record of the homicides, cold cases that the major investigations, none of my homicide investigations, in truth, the cold cases, went to court in the time I was looking at them. I moved on to other things. They were handed on. I know since the people that took over from me have detected some of them, whether it be from my work or from new evidence, I don't know. That's great. You don't own these things, you contribute to them in your time. But some of the rapes, of all the rapes that occurred that were in my pot to look at, the cold cases, I would cherry pick the ones that had forensic value, and we would look at that. And where they came up with positive results, we would go speak to a victim. The reality in UK law enforcement is you're unlikely to get a successful prosecution if a victim isn't prepared to come forward and give evidence. And the courtroom can be very challenging. Bear in mind, unlike a homicide where the victim's dead, they've gone through pain, but they're now dead. A victim of a serious sexual offence has learnt to have to live with it, and the and probably think that the offenders out there may even know the offender if it was a domestic or some kind of community rape, and they do occur, family members, things like that. They've had to come to terms with it. They would also have been investigated back when the police were nothing like as good as they are now in supporting and being sensitive to what the victims go through. Law enforcement doesn't have a great record of it treat the victims historically, and that's just a lesson that we've learned. So imagine here you are, you were raped 20 years ago. You've put it to bed. You've tried to move on with your life. It's still this horrible thing in your heart and your mind that you can't let go. But day to day you're coping, and you get the knock at the door, and at the door is Howard or a member of Howard's team saying, "Hello, can I come and have a chat? We've been reinvestigating your offence, and we think we've found a suspect good enough to arrest them and take them to court. Would you prepared to give evidence?" I've done that many, many times with my team. Been very lucky. We were able to prove, because we'd done so many, that other victims would say they were great. They put their arms around me and helped me through the court process. It was nothing like as painful. It wasn't like I experienced the first time around when it first got looked at. And we were successful. And the analogy I would give is, think about if you found you got some horrific disease, say cancer, and the doctor says, "Look, you've got cancer. If you don't cure it, it will die. You will die. If you go through this particular medical procedure, it will be painful and there's no guarantee of success." The first thing you're going to say is, "Well, how many people survive after this process?" If they turned around and said, "Well, so far nobody's ever died," even though it was difficult to go through, you're probably going to say, "Yeah, we were lucky in that event that the victims came forward." And they weren't just females. We had some male rape victims. And had they said no, we would stop and put it back on file, because we can't go any further. And that's the victim's right. You've got to be sensitive to how they feel and their life. But if they said yes, we would reinvestigate. And of those where we reinvestigated, if we got to a point where we had the evidence that the Crown Prosecution Service, which is an independent body in the UK that decides whether or not a police case goes to court or doesn't, if they said yes, those that went to court, I never lost, or we never lost. We detected 100% of the ones we took to court. But even that's a false figure, because it's a portion of a portion of a portion. Had I investigated all of them, even the ones where there was no forensic evidence, and even the ones where the victim said, "I'm not cooperated in any way, I've moved on, thank you, goodbye," it wouldn't have been 100%.
No, fair enough.
Do you see what I'm saying?
No, it's like Goodhart's law, right? Essentially, once you have a target, it gets corrupted and all the rest of it.
The one target should be the best possible outcome. I would consider that I had completed a successful homicide investigation if I'd explored and was happy that I'd covered every possible line of inquiry I could and put it to bed before it was closed. Even though I may not have caught somebody, I'd done the best I could with it at the time. Kind of a triage process.
Well, to take us out then, if we haven't covered it already, I'm sorry for the lowball question. Is there anything what is the biggest thing that you think people don't understand about cold case, or maybe the thing that people get wrong? Something that's missing, do you think, from the main narrative?
I think they think it's a point in time. We're going to have an investigation for cold case from point A to point B, like we're going to have a homicide investigation. And again, this comes back to the media. If you watch some of the shows, there's a very popular one, Cold Case, or the other one, what's that? CSI, which is kind of a forensic. It's not just murders, but it does murders. They're all good looking. Of all the avenues, it's funny how the evidence drops into line and fits, and they're all detected within an hour. Life isn't like that. So the point I would make is, don't think of homicide as an event on its own or the cold case. Think of this timeline, and along that timeline, somebody gets killed. From that point on, they're reviewing it. And in an ideal world, subject to resources, they review everything to the fullest extent. Even I would make a case for reviewing cases that have been detected to try and minimise the wrongful detections and the innocent people that go to prison. Thankfully, there aren't many that are known of, but usually those cases only get revisited, not because of the police, because somebody, member of either the suspect who's in prison, who's an innocent party, or their family, fight, and they do an investigation almost outside the police to come up with a reason why the police should revisit it. Now, in an ideal society, law enforcement and the authorities should be doing that as well. But we don't have infinite resources. Life ain't like that. Shit happens. So I would say the biggest thing is it's not a discrete event. It's not a discrete 1 hour TV show any more than homicide is. It's a long, complicated thing that starts from the point where somebody starts thinking about killing somebody to the point at which the last person who remembers the last person who was killed, victim's family or friend, dies. So it passes from people's memories.
That's a good place to wind up there. And we could go on for many hours to come. I think we might come back to Cold Case and go into a bit more deeper dive later on.
Again, the point that you made is a good one. We're doing this just to kind of bookend the process. I'm completely open in principle. If people who listen to this, when they think about it, think, actually, I've got some questions, or there's an area of this process, could you cover it? I'm certainly more than happy to do that, because there's an awful lot that we haven't touched on. We've literally just scratched the surface, but hopefully giving people a different way of looking at these things just in the media.
There's more to come, and I think that'll be a good place to wrap it up there. I just got a couple of bit of housekeeping for people still with us. So we've had some feedback from people. It's all been great. I really want to thank people who've got in touch and been supportive. I hate in podcasts with calls to action. Don't forget to like and subscribe and things of that nature. But unfortunately, the reality is we're in a constant war with the YouTube algorithm. We're in constant war with the podcast algorithms. If you do like this podcast and you do want more content, if you could please like and subscribe on any of the platforms that you listen to, and if you could please maybe refer us to anybody you think that might like the content, because being a long form, audio only non-fiction podcast has its challenges. That being said, I'm quite taken aback by some of the feedback that we've had. If you do want to get involved, visit the website, thecollators.com. There's a support site there, and feel free to get in touch. And as Howard has alluded to, we are very open to discussing intelligence, homicide, cold cases, or anything law enforcement. We would love to hear from you. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of The Collators. Thanks very much.
This episode of The Collators was hosted by Mark Lockwood and Howard Atkin. If you like the podcast, don't forget to like and subscribe. You can find more episodes over at thecollators.com. Thank you for listening.